The sound was the first thing they noticed. A rhythmic scrape and thud that carried down the mountain slope on the clear autumn air. It was a sound of stubborn labor, metal against rock, earth being moved one shovelful at a time. Two men from the settlement below reined in their horses, their eyes scanning the mountainside until they found the source. There he was. Finn. A figure so large he seemed less a man and more a piece of the geology, sprung from the granite itself. His back, a vast landscape of muscle under a worn linen shirt, strained with each motion. A wild mane of dark hair, streaked with grey, fell over his shoulders, and a thick, untamed beard covered the bottom half of his face, catching the light like frost. He was digging. Not a well, not a root cellar, but a grate, long wound in the earth, a trench easily 50 feet long and half as deep. Miller, the settlement storekeeper, cupped a hand to his mouth. Finn. What in God's name are you doing up there? Trying to dig your way to China. His voice was thin and sharp, meant to carry, meant to mock. His companion, a farmer named Finch with a perpetually worried face, chuckled nervously. Finn paused, his shovel planted in the dirt. He didn't turn. He simply stood, breathing hard, his breath pluming in the crisp air. He was a man who had forgotten the shape of easy conversation, a man whose silence had grown into a shell around him since his wife, Martha, had been laid to rest in the small plot behind his cabin 2 years prior. He was utterly alone, and the mountain had become his only confidant. After a long moment, he resumed his work. Scrape. Thud. The sound was his only answer. Lost his senses, Finch muttered, shaking his head. That grief, it's hollowed him out. Look at him. It's a grave he's digging, a miller snorted, a cruel, dismissive sound. It's a fool's pit. Wasting the last good weeks before the ground freezes solid. He should be salting meat, checking his woodpile. Instead, he's moving a mountain one spoonful at a time. They watched for another minute as Finn heaved a boulder the size of a small pig from the trench, his muscles cording in his arms. He rolled it to the side without ceremony and immediately drove the shovel back into the earth. The sheer, relentless physicality of it was unsettling. It wasn't the work of a man preparing for winter. It was the work of a man possessed by an idea no one else could see. Their laughter followed them as they turned their horses back toward the valley, the sound bouncing off the rocks and dying long before it reached the man who paid it no mind. He just kept digging. The project consumed him. From the first light that broke over the eastern peaks to the last purple stain of dusk, Finn worked in the trench. It was more than a hole, it was a piece of careful architecture born from a quiet, desperate intelligence. He had chosen the spot with precision, a south-facing slope that would catch every minute of the low winter sun, shielded from the prevailing northern winds by a high granite ridge. The labor was brutal. His hands, already calloused, split and bled, but he ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips of cloth and continuing. He lined the bottom and the northern wall of the pit with flat, dark stones he hauled from a nearby rockslide, laying them with a mason's care. He knew these stones would drink the faint sunlight during the day and bleed that warmth back into the soil through the long, cold nights. He was building a heat sink, a thermal battery made of rock and earth. When the digging was done, he began the second phase of his monumental task. With 2 heavy wooden buckets yoked across his massive shoulders, he made endless trips to the creek bed far below. He bypassed the thin, rocky topsoil of the mountainside, instead harvesting the rich, black loam that had collected in the eddies of the stream for centuries. Each journey was a slow, grueling ascent, his legs burning, his lungs aching in the thin air. He filled the trench with this borrowed fertility, bucket by painstaking bucket, until the dark, living soil was 3 feet deep. The men in the settlement saw him from a distance, a tiny, toiling speck on the vast canvas of the mountain, and the story of his folly grew. They said he was trying to build a new garden to heaven, to be closer to his lost wife. They said the loneliness had finally cracked him open and let the madness in. Finally, he brought out the seed potatoes. They were his most precious commodity, saved from the last harvest he and Martha had shared. He laid them out in neat, careful rows in the dark soil of his sunken world. When the last one was planted, he stood back, his body a single, comprehensive ache. The dugout garden was an ugly, incongruous scar on the landscape. Over it, he constructed a crude framework of pine branches, a skeleton on which he would later stretch the heavy, oiled hides he'd spent the last month preparing. To anyone else, it was a bizarre monument to wasted effort. To Finn, it was an arc. He had watched the patterns of the last 2 years. The summers growing shorter, the frosts arriving earlier, the winters biting deeper. He remembered Martha's grandfather, a man of the old tribes, speaking of a long cold, a time when the sky turned pale and the earth refused to give. Finn was not a man of prophecy, but he was a man who listened to the mountain, and the mountain was telling him to prepare. His next trip to the settlement for flour and salt was a trial in quiet endurance. The moment he pushed open the door to Miller's Mercantile, the low hum of conversation ceased. It was as if a switch had been thrown. The half-dozen men gathered around the pot-bellied stove fell silent, their eyes flicking toward him and then quickly away. They looked at his huge, imposing frame, his wild hair and beard, and the dirt permanently ingrained in the lines of his hands, and they saw not a neighbor but an omen. Miller polished the counter with a rag, his movements suddenly very deliberate. "Finn," he said, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "Need anything?" "Got some new shovels in, if you've worn the other one out." A few of the men snickered into their hands. The joke was stale, but their need to reinforce their shared certainty over his strangeness was not. Finn slid his list across the counter without a word. He could feel their stares on his back, a physical pressure. He was a landmark of their pity, a cautionary tale whispered among them. He was a good man before she passed, they would say. Now, well, you see him. He gathered his supplies, the weight of the flour sack a familiar comfort on his shoulder. As he turned to leave, Finch stepped into his path, blocking the doorway. The farmer's face was earnest, a mask of well-intentioned condescension. "Finn, I mean this for your own good," he began, his voice low. "That pit, the soil will stay too cold. Potatoes need sun on the leaves, warmth on the ground. They'll rot in that shadow hole you've dug. You're throwing away good seed." Finn looked down at the smaller man. He saw the genuine, misplaced concern in his eyes, and behind it, the bedrock of absolute certainty that his own way, the way things had always been done, was the only way. "We'll see," Finn said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the finality of a stone dropping into a deep well. He moved past Finch, the crowd parting before him, and stepped back out into the clean, cold air, leaving the warmth and whispers of the settlement behind. He preferred the silence. It was honest. The signs grew more insistent as autumn deepened. The vibrant gold of the aspen groves lasted only a few days before a hard wind stripped the branches bare, leaving skeletal fingers clawing at a steel-gray sky. The morning frost, once a delicate silver lacework, became a thick, white blanket that lingered in the shadows well past noon. The birds that usually filled the air with song departed early, a silent, urgent exodus. Down in the valley, the farmers harvested their corn and squash, their movements hurried, their faces tight with a low-grade anxiety they refused to voice. They cast nervous glances at the sky, at the unusual chill that clung to the air even in the midday sun, but they continued to trust the familiar rhythm of the seasons. Their potato fields, vast and exposed, were their pride, the backbone of their winter larders. The vines were still green, the promise of a bountiful harvest still swelling in the earth beneath. They told themselves it was just a cold snap, a shiver before the long sleep of winter. Finn felt the change not as a threat, but as an arrival. He moved with a calm, focused purpose. He spent 2 days meticulously stretching the heavy, greased hides over the timber frame of his dugout garden, lashing them down with thick leather cords. When he was finished, the pit was sealed, transformed into a low, dark mound on the hillside. He banked soil around the edges, plugging every gap, sealing his subterranean world against the coming cold. That night, the first true freeze descended. It was not a gradual cooling but a sudden, sharp plunge, as if a door to the north had been thrown open. In the morning, the entire landscape was encased in a brittle, glittering shell of ice. The water in Finn's rain barrel was frozen solid. Down in the valley, the farmers awoke to a devastating sight. The vibrant green leaves of their potato vines had turned black and gelatinous, collapsing as if boiled. A wave of fear rippled through the settlement, but it was tempered with hope. The vines were lost, but surely the tubers, protected by the soil, had survived. They just had to wait for the ground to thaw enough to dig. Finn, meanwhile, lifted a corner of the hide cover on his dugout. A puff of cool, damp air, smelling of rich earth, escaped. Inside, in the dim light, his potato plants were untouched, their leaves a defiant, living green. The killing freeze was a quiet apocalypse. It came without a storm, without wind or snow, arriving instead on a current of unnervingly still, crystalline air. For 3 days and 3 nights, the temperature remained brutally low. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The smoke from the settlement's chimneys rose in thin, straight lines, the only sign of life in a landscape locked in ice. The very sound of the world changed, the creek was silenced, and the trees groaned and cracked in the profound cold, their sap freezing and expanding within them. No one ventured far from their hearth. It was a cold that felt ancient and personal, a cold that seeped through the thickest walls and settled deep in the bones. On the 4th morning, a weak sun appeared, and the temperature grudgingly climbed. The great freeze was over. A collective sigh of relief passed through the valley, followed by a surge of anxious activity. Men headed for their fields, shovels in hand, their boots crunching on the stiff, frozen ground. Finch was among the first. He drove his shovel into the earth of his largest field, the one that had always given him the most reliable yield. The ground was like iron. It took him several minutes of hard, jarring work to break through the frozen crust. He finally managed to turn over a clump of soil and knelt, his bare hand scrabbling at the icy dirt. He pulled one free. It was hard and heavy as a rock. He struck it against his shovel, and it made a dull, solid clink. Frozen solid. He dug another, and another. They were all the same. A terrible understanding dawned on him. When these potatoes thawed, they wouldn't be food. They would be a foul, watery mush, a black rot. He stood up slowly, looking out across his field, at the acres and acres of buried ruin. His entire winter's supply, the food that was meant to see his family through to the spring, was gone. The same scene of quiet, desperate discovery was repeating itself on every farm. The valley's entire potato crop, the very foundation of their survival, had been wiped out in 3 silent nights. The panic that had been a low hum of anxiety was now a rising scream. A week later, the first snow fell, dusting the valley in a thin layer of white that did nothing to hide the black, dead fields. The mood in the settlement had turned grim. Miller's store was rationing flour, his supplies dwindling with no new shipments expected until the spring thaw. The communal hope had curdled into individual fear. It was in this atmosphere of quiet desperation that a lone figure was seen making his way up the mountain path toward Finn's cabin. It was Finch. He walked with his head down, his shoulders slumped, the picture of a defeated man. He stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, standing in the snow, turning his worn hat over and over in his hands. He didn't call out. He just waited. After a long time, the cabin door opened and Finn emerged. He stood on the porch, a silent giant, his breath misting in the air. He simply looked at Finch, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with the history of mockery and misjudgment. Finally, Finch found his voice, a raw, broken whisper. "Finn, that pit you dug," he swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. Did anything in it survive the freeze?" Finn didn't answer right away. He let the question hang in the frozen air, a final, necessary penance. He watched the hope and shame warring in the farmer's eyes. Then, slowly, he gave a single, deliberate nod. Without a word, he led Finch to the low, hide-covered mound. He untied one of the leather cords and pulled back a heavy flap. Finch peered into the darkness, his eyes adjusting slowly. He gasped. It was like looking into another world, a secret spring hidden in the heart of a dead winter. The air that rose from the dugout was cool but alive, smelling of damp soil and green things. Rows of healthy potato plants, their leaves lush and unwithered, filled the space. It was impossible. It was a miracle. Finn reached in, his large hand gentle, and dug around the base of one plant. He pulled it up, and clinging to its roots were a half-dozen perfectly formed potatoes, their skin smooth and clean. They were not just food, they were a symbol of a wisdom Finch had been too blind to see. I'll buy them, Finch stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Name your price. Anything. Finn looked at the perfect potatoes in his hand, then at the desperate man before him. He went back to his cabin and returned with a small burlap sack, which he filled. He held it out to Finch. This is for your family, he said, his voice a low rumble. It's not for sale. The news of Finch's return with a sack of perfect potatoes spread through the settlement faster than a winter fever. At first, there was disbelief, then a frantic, desperate hope. The madman on the mountain had food. The Fool's Pit was a cellar full of life. The trickle of visitors started the next day. They came not with mockery, but with a humbled, fearful reverence. They climbed the path to his cabin and stood where Finch had stood, their hats in their hands, their eyes pleading. They offered to trade anything they had, a salted ham, a jar of preserved peaches, a day's labor. Finn met each of them with the same stoic silence. He assessed their need, the hunger etched into their faces, and gave what he could. A few potatoes for this family, a small handful for that one. He was careful, measuring out his generosity against the long, hard months that still lay ahead. His supply was large, but it was not infinite. But as the weeks wore on and the deep winter settled in, the hunger in the valley sharpened into a more dangerous emotion. Gratitude began to curdle into resentment. The whispers started again, but their tone had changed. He's got a whole pit full, they'd mutter around the stove at Miller's. Why is he hoarding it? He's one man. We're a whole community. The man they had pitied was now a man they envied, and envy was a short step from anger. The path to his cabin, once a trail of supplicants, now felt like the approach to a fortress under siege. One evening, Miller made the climb himself. His face was grim. You need to be careful, Finn, he warned, his voice low. The talk in town is getting ugly. A man named Peterson, he's saying you have a duty to share it all. That if you won't, they've got a right to take it. Miller looked at the dugout garden, its dark shape barely visible in the twilight. That food is a blessing, Finn. But it's also a curse. It makes you a target. After Miller left, Finn didn't go inside. He walked the perimeter of his small homestead, the crunch of his boots on the snow the only sound. He reinforced the simple fence around the garden, not because it would stop a determined man, but because it was an act of defiance. The cold had been an honest enemy. This new threat felt foul, a betrayal of the mercy he had shown. He took to spending his nights by his window, watching the moonlit snow, listening for the sound of footsteps that were no longer coming to beg. The night they came was clear and brutally cold, the sky glittering with a billion indifferent stars. Finn wasn't asleep. He was sitting in the darkness of his cabin, a feeling of grim certainty settled in his gut. He heard them before he saw them, the muffled crunch of many feet on the frozen snow, a sound that tried and failed to be stealthy. He rose from his chair, his huge frame filling the small room, and picked up the heavy shovel that leaned against the wall. It felt solid and familiar in his hands. He didn't light a lamp. He stepped outside onto the porch and waited in the deep shadow, a silent, looming presence. There were 5 of them, dark figures moving purposefully toward the dugout garden. They carried sacks and tools, their faces obscured by pulled-down hats and the darkness. He recognized Peterson's broad-shouldered silhouette in the lead. They reached the flimsy fence and began tearing it down, the snapping of the dry wood unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. That was when Finn moved. He stepped out from the shadows of the porch into the stark moonlight, the shovel held loosely at his side. The men froze, their heads snapping up. They hadn't expected a confrontation. They had expected to steal from a sleeping man. Peterson took a half-step forward, his voice a low, challenging growl. We don't want any trouble, Finn. We're just taking what we need. For our families. The other men shifted their weight, their hands tightening on their tools. They were not thieves by nature, they were desperate men pushed past their limits. And when this is gone? Finn's voice was a low rumble, carrying easily in the still air. It held no fear, only a profound weariness. What will you do then? You will have eaten your future. You will have eaten the seed for next year's crop. He wasn't just protecting his food. He was protecting their only hope of ever feeding themselves again. A tense standoff ensued. The moonlight glinted off the metal head of a pickaxe one of the men was holding. For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable, 5 desperate men against one giant. The cold air was thick with the possibility of it. Finn looked at the hungry, fearful faces before him. He saw Peterson, a man who had laughed at him. He saw the others, men who had averted their eyes in the store. He saw their desperation, and he understood it. But he also saw the folly of their path, a spiral of taking that would lead only to a deeper starvation. He made a choice. He could have fought them. He was larger and stronger than any 2 of them combined. He could have hurt them badly. Instead, he raised the shovel, not as a weapon, but as a tool. He drove its steel edge into the frozen ground at his feet. The sound rang out like a hammer blow. "You want potatoes," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Then you will learn to work for them. Not just for this winter. For all the winters to come." He turned and pointed with the shovel toward the valley, a sweeping gesture into the darkness. "My way works. You've seen it. You've tasted the proof. Now you will learn it." He offered them a pact, not a pardon. He would give them food from his store, enough to keep their families from starving. He would give them precious seed potatoes for the spring. In return, starting the next day, they would work. They would help him dig. Not for him, but for themselves. "We will build a new garden," he declared. "Down there. A bigger one. One for the entire community. You will learn to read the mountain. You will learn to protect the soil. You will not come here as thieves in the night again." The men were stunned into silence. They had come for a confrontation and had been met with a command. They had expected a fight over food and had been handed a blueprint for survival. From the edge of the clearing, a 6th figure stepped into the moonlight. It was Finch. He had followed the men, fearing what they might do. He walked to stand beside Finn, facing the others. "His right," Finch said, his voice clear and steady. "We were fools. We laughed while he worked, and now we starve while he eats. The lesson is right here in front of us." The tension broke. Peterson looked at Finn, then at the shovel in the ground, then at his own empty hands. He slowly lowered the pickaxe. One by one, the other men did the same. They had come to take, but they would stay to learn. The winter that followed was the hardest in living memory, but no one starved. Finn kept his word, rationing his potatoes to the families of the settlement, ensuring everyone had enough to get by. And the men kept theirs. Every day that the weather allowed, a work crew made their way to a sheltered basin just above the valley floor, a spot Finn had chosen for its superior sun exposure and protection from the wind. With Finn directing them, they began to dig. It was back-breaking, soul-testing labor. The ground was frozen hard, and they had to use pickaxes and fires to thaw it enough to make progress. But they worked with a grim determination they had never known before. They were not just digging a hole, they were digging their way out of despair. Finn was no longer an outcast. He was their teacher, their commander. He taught them how to line the pit with heat-retaining stones, how to identify and harvest the richest soil, how to build a sturdy frame for the covers they were now all busy preparing. He taught them the subtle language of the mountain, how to read the patterns of the frost, the direction of the wind, the behavior of the animals. He gave them not just a method, but a new way of seeing the world they inhabited. When the spring thaw finally arrived, melting the snow and softening the earth, the communal dugout garden was ready. It was a massive undertaking, far larger than Finn's own, a testament to their shared labor. The day of planting was a solemn, hopeful affair. The entire settlement was there. Finn distributed the seed potatoes he had carefully saved, placing them into the hands of the very men who had come to steal from him. They took them with a quiet reverence. There were no grand speeches, no soaring words of gratitude. There was only the shared, rhythmic work of planting, of placing hope into the dark, protected earth. Finn worked alongside them, his huge frame no longer a symbol of his isolation, but of his strength and foresight. They no longer saw a madman. They saw the man who had saved them, not by giving them what they wanted, but by teaching them what they needed. The garden became the new center of their community, a permanent structure that would protect them for generations. His lonely, ridiculed pit on the mountainside had become their shared doctrine, his private wisdom their communal salvation. They had learned to look down, into the earth, to find their way forward.